Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How are you guys doing? Can you guys hear me? Can I have indication if you can hear me and see the screen that I'm sharing, the slides? Awesome. I'm also doing well, thanks. Let's give another minute or two and give more time for people to. Okay, so let's start with today's lecture. So we have now yesterday looked at how the solar system formed is where we ended off. But now we can zoom in a little bit closer to our different planets and create a study of the planets. So the closest place we can start is with Earth because it is the planet that we live on. So we can know what we've learned about the Earth and the moon. And we can extrapolate that to different planets in our solar system as well. So for today's lecture, we are going to, in essence, put together a travel guide for the terrestrial planets. And we are going to start looking at Earth as well as the Moon. So, a question. Do you guys know what image this is? And it's probably one of the most important images in the history of humankind. Any idea? Yes, this is from the Apollo spacecraft. If I'm remembering correctly, this is from the Apollo 11 missions. And this image is named Moonrise. So this was one of the first, Moonrise, Earthrise. And this was one of the first ever images of Earth. And you can see how it is stitched together vertically. So if you took this as a color photo, this is how it looks like in color, called Earthrise, one of the most important photos in human history. And you can Google it, and there's a whole story behind it as well. So for this lecture, we need to answer 4 questions. Firstly, how did the Earth and its moon compare with the other terrestrial worlds? Secondly, how has Earth changed and evolved since it is formed? Thirdly, why is the moon airless, heavy cratered, and geologically inactive? And then lastly, how are the histories of Earth and the moon connected? So we start off this lecture with a method we call comparative planetology, meaning we can study the different planets separately and also compare these planets. So the Earth and the Moon are ideal starting points for the study because they are respectively the largest and the smallest of the 5 terrestrial worlds. So remember, the terrestrial worlds is Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and the Moon. Its crust is active with moving continents, earthquakes, volcanoes, and ongoing mountain building. Earth's oxygen-rich atmosphere and water-covered surface are unique in a solar system, and in contrast, the Moon is geologically inactive and has no atmosphere. Nevertheless, the histories of Earth and the Moon are intertwined. So you will meet the other 3 terrestrial worlds, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, in the next chapter and find that many of their properties fit between the benchmarks set by Earth and the Moon. So if you first visit the city of Granada in Spain, you will probably consult a travel guide. If it is a good guide, it will do more than tell you where to find museums and restrooms. It will give you a preview of what to expect, and you are beginning a journey to the Earth-like worlds. So you should consult a travel guide and see what it has in store. So in this chapter, you will visit Earth, Earth's moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. It might surprise you that a moon is included in your itinerary. It is, after all, just a natural satellite orbiting Earth and isn't one of the planets. But the moon is a fascinating world on its own. It makes striking comparison with the other worlds on your list. And its history gives you important information about the history of Earth and the other planets. So in this image, you can go through it in your own time, but here you can see how these different 5 worlds compare to one another. So the first thing we need to talk about these 5 worlds are the core, the mantle, and the crust. So the terrestrial worlds are made up of rock and metal, and planetary scientists have evidence that they are all differentiated, which means each world is separated into layers of different density, with a dense metallic core surrounded by less dense rocky mantle, and a low density crust on the outside. And as you learned in chapter 15, when the planets formed, these surfaces were subjected to heavy bombardment by leftover planetesimals and other debris in the young solar system. So you will see lots of craters on these worlds, especially on Mercury and the Moon, many of them dating back to the heavy bombardment era. So notice that cratered surfaces are also old. For example, if lava flow covered up some cratered landscape after the end of the heavy bombardment, few craters could be formed later and at surface because most of the debris in the solar system was gone. So when you see a smooth plane on a planet, you can be sure that the surface is younger than the heavily cratered areas. Another important way you can study a planet is by following the energy flow. In the preceding chapter, you learned that the heat in the interior of a planet may be partly from radioactive decay and partly left over from planet's formation. But in any case, it must flow outward towards the cooler surface where it is radiated into space. In the process of flowing outward, the heat can cause convection currents in the liquid interior, magnetic fields, plate motions, quakes, faults, volcanism, mountain building, and more. Heat flowing outward through the cooler crust make a large world like Earth geologically active in contrast. The Moon and Mercury, both small worlds, cooled quickly inside, so they have little heat flowing outward now and are relatively inactive. So most of these terrestrial worlds also have some sort of atmosphere. So when you look at Mercury and the Moon, you can see their craters, plains, and mountains clearly. And neither has a substantial atmosphere to obscure your view. In comparison, the surface of Venus is completely hidden by a cloudy atmosphere and even thicker than Earth's. And Mars, the medium-sized planet, has a relatively thin atmosphere. You might ponder two questions. Firstly, why do some worlds have atmospheres while some do not? And you will discover that both size and temperature are important. And the second question is more complex. Where did those atmospheres come from? To answer that question in later chapters, you will have to understand the history of these worlds. So the 4 stages of planetary development. This is a good question I like to ask for the exam. So this is a hint for you guys. I can ask, well, I usually ask what are the 4 stages, or I can ask what are the 4 stages and describe the 4 stages as well. So like other terrestrial planets, Earth formed from the inner solar nebula about 4.6 billion years ago. Even as it took form, it began to change, and there is evidence that Earth and the other terrestrial planets, plus Earth's moon, passed through 4 developmental stages. So the first stage is differentiation. That produces a dense core, thick mantle, and low density crust. At the young Earth, the first stage is differentiation. The second stage is bombardment. So the young Earth was heavily bombarded in the debris-filled early the solar systems. Then the third stage is flooding. By molten rock and later by water can fill lowlands. And then lastly, slow surface evolution continues due to geological process, including in erosion. So the 4 stages is differentiation, heavy bombardment, flooding, and slow surface evolution. You guys happy with those 4 points? You guys happy with them? Awesome. So you can just read up about those 4 stages in more detail. So the next thing we need to talk about is Earth's interior. So you've read that there is evidence Earth is differentiated into a dense metallic core with lower density rocky mantle and crust. But what is the evidence for this? A very simple argument is based on the fact that Earth's average density, which can be calculated easily from its mass and volume, is 5.5 grams per cubic centimeter. But the silicate rocks on Earth's surface have only about half that density. Therefore, a large part of Earth's interior must be made of material much denser than crustal rock. And can more detailed information be determined from Earth's interior? Yes, it can. So, although even the deepest mines and wells extended only a few kilometers down and don't even reach the bottom of the crust, exploration of Earth's interior is possible because earthquakes produce vibrations called seismic waves that travel through the crust and interior and eventually register on sensitive detectors called seismographs all over the world. 2 kinds of seismic waves are important in this exploration. We get P waves, that stands for pressure waves, that travel as a series of compressions and uncompressions, like sound, and can pass through a liquid in contrast. Then we get S waves or shear waves, travel as a type of side-to-side vibration that can't pass through a liquid. So when an earthquake occurs, no direct shear wave passes through the core to register on seismographs on the opposite side of Earth. as if the core was casting a shadow. So the absence of S-waves show that a core is mostly liquid, and the size of the S-wave shadow shows that the outer boundary of the core lies slightly more than halfway between Earth's center and its surface. So here we can see P waves and S waves penetrate through Earth's core, but S waves cannot penetrate through it, and that is the way we can map the core of our world. The P and the S waves caused by an earthquake do not travel in straight lines or at constant speed within Earth. The waves may reflect off boundaries between layers of different density, or they may be refracted as they pass through a boundary. And their speed is greater in regions of high temperature and density. Geoscientists can use the arrival times of reflected and refracted seismic waves from distant earthquakes to construct a detailed model of Earth's interior. Such studies confirm that the interior consists of three parts: the central core, a thick mantle, and a thin crust. So mathematical models based on the seismic data indicate that a core is hot, so about 6,000 degrees Kelvin, dense, about 13 grams per cubic centimeter, and composed of iron and nickel. The core of Earth as hot as the gases at the sun's surface, but high pressure keeps the mantle solid near the center of the core and liquid in its outer part. Earth's magnetism gives you further evidence about a core. The presence of a magnetic field is a clue that part of Earth's core must be a liquid metal. Convection currents stir the liquid, and it also rotates as Earth rotates. And because of these motions, and because it is a very good conductor of electricity, the liquid outer core generates a magnetic field through the dynamo effect, a different version of the process that creates the sun magnetic field. So from traces of magnetic field retained by rocks that formed long ago, geologists conclude that Earth's magnetic field has reversed itself in an irregular pattern. On average, a few times per million years. Occasionally, reversals through poorly understood seem to be characteristics of the dynamo effect. The paths of the seismic waves in the mantle, the layer of dense rock that lies between a molten core and a crust, shows that it's not molten, but it is not really solid either. Mantle material behaves like a plastic, a material with the properties of a solid but capable of flowing under pressure. The asphalt used in paving roads is a common example of a plastic. It shatters if a truck with a sledgehammer, but bends under the steady weight of a heavy truck, just because Earth's crust, where the pressure is less at greater depths, the mantle is mostly plastic. But Earth has also an active crust. So Earth's crust is compressed of low-density rock that floats on the mantle. And the image of a rock floating seems odd, but recall that the rock of the mantle is very dense. Also, just below the crust, the mantle rock tends to be highly plastic, so great sections of low-density crust do indeed float on a semi-liquid mantle, like great lily pads floating on a pond. The crust is thickest under the continents, up to 60 kilometers thick, and thinnest under the oceans, where it's only about 10 kilometers thick. Unlike the mantle, the crust is brittle and can break when it's stressed. So the motion of the crust and the erosive action of water make Earth's crust highly active. And notice 3 important points and 6 new terms. Plate tectonics, so the motion of crustal plates, produce much of the geological activity on Earth. Plates spreading apart can form rift valleys or on ocean floor, mid-ocean rises where molten rock solidifies to form basalt. A plate sliding into a subduction zone can trigger volcanism. And collision of plates can produce folded mountain ranges. Change of volcanoes, such as the Hawaiian Islands, can result when plate moves horizontally across a hotspot. So notice how the continents on Earth's surface have moved and changed over periods of hundreds of millions of years. 100 million years is only 0.1 billion years, or 1/46 the age of Earth. So sections of Earth's crust are in rapid motion from the perspective of geologic timescales. Most of geological features mountain ranges, the Grand Canyon, and even the familiar outline of the continents, are recent products of Earth's active surface. So Earth's surface is constantly renewed. The oldest rocks on Earth, small crystals of the mineral zircon from Western Australia, are 4.4 billion years old. And most of the crust is much younger than that. So most of the mountains and valleys you see around you are no more than a few tens of millions of years old. You can see that Earth's dramatic geology is dominated by two processes. Heat from rising from the interior drives plate tectonics. Just below the thin crust of solid rock lies the semi-molten layer with motions that can rip the crust to fragments, push the pieces about like rafts of wood on a pond, and sometimes crash them together to raise mountain ranges and grow continents. The second process modifying the crust is water. It falls as rain and snow and tears down mountains, erodes river valleys, and washes soil and rock into sea. Tectonics builds up mountains and continents, and then erosion rips them down again. So we can tell the story without mentioning that Earth has an atmosphere. So not only is it necessary for life, but it's also intimately related to the crust. It affects the surface through erosion by wind and water, and in turn the chemistry of Earth's surface affects the composition of the atmosphere. A modern understanding of planet building is that Earth formed so rapidly that it was substantially heated by the impacts of infalling material as well as by radioactive decay. So the young Earth have been highly volcanically active. So when a volcano erupts, 50 to 80% of that gas released is water vapor. The rest is mostly carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and small amounts of sulfur gases such as hydrogen sulfide. The rotten egg gas that you smell if you visit a geothermal pools and geysers such as at Yellowstone National Park. If Earth's surface was molten as it formed, then outgassing would have been continuous, and Earth's original primary atmosphere would have been rich in water vapor, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. So astronomers have suspected that some of the abundant water on Earth arrived late in the planet's formation process as bombardment of volatile-rich comets. And spectroscopic studies of the comets revealed that some comets, such as Comet Hartley 2, which was visited in 2010 by the Deep Impact Probe, have ratios of deuterium to hydrogen matching the ratios of the water on Earth, while other comets do not. And details of the origin of Earth's atmosphere and oceans are yet to be fully understood and are subjects of current research. The atmosphere you breathe now is a secondary atmosphere, produced later in Earth's history by chemical reactions between the atmosphere, crustal rocks, and surface water, and by green plants producing oxygen. So carbon dioxide is easily soluble in water, which is why carbonated beverages are so easy to manufacture. So the early oceans began to absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide. So once in solution, the carbon dioxide reacted with dissolved substances in the seawater to form silicon dioxide, limestone, and other mineral sediments in the ocean floor, freeing the seawater to absorb more carbon dioxide. Thanks to those chemical reactions in the oceans, most of the carbon dioxide was transferred from Earth's atmosphere to seafloor sediments. So when Earth was young, its atmosphere had no free oxygen. That oxygen not combined with other elements. So oxygen is very reactive and quickly forms oxides to soil or combines with iron and other substances dissolved in water. Only the action of plant life keeps a steady supply of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere via photosynthesis, which makes energy for plants by absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. Beginning about 2 to 2.5 billion years ago, photosynthetic plants and the oceans had multiplied to the point where they made oxygen at a rate faster than chemical reactions could remove it from the atmosphere. After that time, atmospheric oxygen increased rapidly. And it is a common misconception that there is life on Earth because of oxygen. The truth is exactly the opposite. There is oxygen in Earth's atmosphere because of life. Most life forms on Earth do not need oxygen except the minority of creatures that are animals, including us. And some are even poisoned by it. So once the atmosphere began to contain abundant ordinary oxygen, so O2, Earth's lower atmosphere became protected from ultraviolet solar radiation by an ozone layer about 15 to 30 kilometers above the surface. Ozone molecules are very good at absorbing ultraviolet photons. An ozone molecule consists of three oxygen atoms linked together. And before there was oxygen, an ozone layer could not form, and the sun's ultraviolet radiation was able to penetrate deep into the atmosphere and break up weaker molecules such as water. The hydrogen from the water then escaped to space, and the oxygen formed oxides in a crust. Earth's atmosphere could not reach its present stable composition until it was protected by an ozone layer, and that required oxygen. So we also have some human effects on the atmosphere, and that is the greenhouse effect. So the Industrial Revolution and processes we are still doing today is continuing the greenhouse effect. So are you guys all familiar and understand the greenhouse effect? Awesome. So then I don't need to discuss that in deeply. So the greenhouse effect, in essence, heats up the Earth's surface. So there's also a common misconception that a greenhouse effect is only bad, but evidence indicates that Earth has had a greenhouse effect for its entire history. Without the greenhouse effect, Earth presently would be at least 30 degrees colder and uninhabitable for most things, including humans. So we have a natural greenhouse effect. But with our industrial revolution and activities as humans, we have caused this natural greenhouse effect to run away until where we are now, where it's actually causing damage to our environment. So it is also a common misconception that human output of CO2 is minor compared to natural sources such as volcanoes. And careful measurements of carbon isotope ratios and relative amounts of CO2 versus O2 in the atmosphere shows that the CO2 added to the atmosphere since the year 1800s is more or entirely due to humans burning fossil fuels. And estimates are that the amount of CO2 in Earth's atmosphere could be doubling in the 21st century. Yet another misconception is that the observed warming of Earth is due to natural causes rather than the greenhouse effect. As scientists began to study early indications that the Earth's global climate is warming and that human-produced CO2 might be a major cause, reacted with professional skepticism. They asked questions such as, is global warming really happening? And if the warming is real, is some mechanism other than human activity the main cause? Experiments were conducted, calculations performed, and models created to answer those types of questions. And such research carried out over decades revealed that regular and predictable changes in Earth's axis, incline and orientation, and the shape of orbit, called the Milankovitch cycles, currently would be driving Earth's climate towards lower, not higher temperatures. Also, observations by space probes indicate that the sun's luminosity average over its activity cycles has been constant for decades, or has decreased slightly. So the observed warming must be strong to be occurring in the face of opposing astronomical effects. So the amount of warming to expect in the future is difficult to predict because Earth's climate is critically sensitive to a number of different factors, not just the abundance of greenhouse gases. So for example, a slight warming should increase water vapor in the atmosphere. And although water vapor is another greenhouse gas, that would enhance the warming. Increased water vapor might cause added cloud cover, increasing Earth's albedo. So Earth's albedo is the fraction of light it receives that is reflected back to space. An increased albedo would then tend to reduce warming. Also, even small changes in temperature can alter circulation patterns in the atmosphere and in the oceans. And its consequences, such as changes, are very difficult to model. The situation is complex, but models that best track the warming that has already happened point to substantial continued warming. So there's also a misconception that ozone is bad because they hear it mentioned as a pollutant of city air produced by auto emissions. Breathing ozone is bad for you, but as you learned earlier in this chapter, the ozone layer in the upper atmosphere protects the lower atmosphere and Earth's surface from harmful solar UV photons. So ozone is an unstable molecule. So certain chemicals such as chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, are used for refrigeration, air conditioning, and some industrial processes can easily destroy ozone. As these CFCs escape into the atmosphere, they become mixed into the ozone layer and convert the ozone back to normal oxygen molecules. Ordinary oxygen does not block ultraviolet radiation. So depleting the ozone layer causes an increase in ultraviolet radiation at Earth's surface. So in small doses, ultraviolet radiation can produce a suntan, but in larger doses, it can cause skin cancers. So here we can see the ozone layer as it was in 1970 increased bigger in the 1990s, and the ozone layer is now on the repair again and is actually closing up. It is also another misconception that global warming and ozone depletion are two names for the same thing. Take careful note that ozone hole is a second Earth environmental issue that is basically separate from global warming. The CO2 and ozone patterns in Earth's atmosphere are paralleled on Venus and Mars. So when you study Venus in chapter 17, you will discover a runaway greenhouse effect that has made the surface of the planet hard enough to melt lead. Also in chapter 17, you will learn that Mars has an atmosphere without an ozone layer. A few minutes of sunbathing on Mars could kill you. Once again, you can learn more about your own planet by studying exaggerated conditions on other planets. So here you can go through this diagram, but this is just a comparative diagram between Earth and the Moon. So You should already know a lot about the moon since you have assignment to do it. But the first persons on the moon, Neil Armstrong said, that's one small step for man, one leap for mankind. Buzz Aldrin, the second person on the moon, said magnificent desolation. In other words, although it's desolate, the moon has its own kind of beauty. And many planets in the universe probably look like Earth's moon. And astronauts may someday walk on such world compared to them when Earth's moon. So throughout history, 12 people have stood on the moon in the Apollo program. But planetary astronomers knew it well. The photographs, measurements, and samples brought back to Earth paint a picture of an ancient battered crust and a world created by planetary catastrophe. So the surface of the moon is divided into two dramatically different kinds of terrain. The dark grey areas visible from Earth's by naked eye are the smooth lunar lowlands, which used the Latin word for seas, and early astronomers named Maria, so plural of mare, which is pronounced mare. So you can also see the comparatively bright, rugged, and heavily cratered lunar highlands. The color of the moon's rock is dark grey, but Earth's moon looks quite bright in the night sky. In fact, the average albedo of Earth's moon, the fraction of light that is reflected, is only about 0.12%. In other words, the moon reflects only 12% of the light of the sunlight it hits. So in comparison, Earth, thanks mostly to its bright clouds, has an average albedo of 31%. So the moon looks bright only in contrast to the night sky. In reality, it's a dark grey world. So whenever you look at a moon, you find craters. These craters look quite dramatic near the terminator, the name for the boundary between daylight and darkness on the moon, where shadows are long. As you have already learned, the highlands are heavily marked by craters, whereas the moon's lowlands contain relatively few craters. Planetary scientists now know that the craters on the moon were formed by impact of meteorites. So study and notice 3 important points plus 5 new terms. Impact craters have certain distinguishing characteristics, such as their shape and their ejecta rays and secondary characters around them. 2. Lunar impact craters range from tiny pits formed micrometeorites to giant multi-ringed basins. And then thirdly, most of the craters on the moon are old. They were formed long ago when the solar system was young. So 12 Apollo astronauts visited the lunar lowlands and highlands between 1969 and 1972. And most of the rocks they found were typical of hardened lava, as some were vesicular basalt, which contained holes formed from bubbles in the molten rock. These bubbles are made when lava flows out into the surface, and the lower pressures allows gases dissolved in a molten rock to expand and form bubbles. The same thing happens when you open a bottle of carbonated beverage and bubbles form. The presence of vesicular basalt shows that much of the surface of the moon has been covered by consecutive lava flows, and the dark flat plains of the lunar lowlands, the morae, are actually solidified ancient lava. So the highlands, in contrast, are composed of rock containing minerals that have low density and would be among the first to solidify and float to the top of molten rock. For example, the highlands are rich in anorthosite, a light-colored and low-density rock that contributes to the highlands' bright contrast with the dark lowlands. So here we can see the different locations where the Apollo program has visited the moon. So with the lunar geology, we can see some of these bubbles that were formed in the rocks. So over the last 2 centuries, astronomers developed 3 different hypotheses for the origin of the moon. The fission hypothesis proposed that a moon broke from a rapidly spinning young Earth. The condensation hypothesis suggested that Earth and its moon condensed from the same cloud of matter in a solar nebula. And the capture hypothesis suggests that a moon formed elsewhere in a solar nebula and was later captured by Earth. Each of these ideas had problems and failed to survive the comparison with all the evidence. In the 1970s, based substantially on analysis of newly available lunar rock samples, a new hypothesis originated that combined some aspects of the three older hypotheses. The large impact hypothesis proposed that a moon formed when a very large planetesimal, estimated to have been at least as massive as Mars, smashed into the proto-Earth, and such a collision would have ejected debris into space. And model calculations indicate that some of the debris would have settled into a disk in orbit around Earth, and material in a disk would then have quickly collected to form the moon. So this is a familiar image, as we can see, from an accretion disk again. So this hypothesis explains several phenomena. If the collision occurred off-center, it would have spun Earth-Moon system rapidly, and this explained the present high angular momentum. If the proto-Earth and impacts had each already differentiated, the ejected material that became the moon would have been mostly iron-poor mantle and crust, which would explain the moon's low density and iron-poor composition. Furthermore, the material would have lost its volatile components while it was in space. So the moon also would have formed lacking volatiles, as was noted in the Apollo rock samples. Such an impact would have melted the proto-Earth, and the material falling together to form the moon would also have been heated hot enough to melt. This fits evidence that the Highland and Orphosite in the moon's oldest rocks formed by differentiation of large quantities of molten material. The large impact hypothesis survives comparison with the known evidence and is now considered likely to be correct. So the four-stage history of Earth's moon is dominated by a single fact that makes its unfolding noticeably different from Earth's history in the later stages. The moon is small, only 1/4 the diameter of Earth. Its escape velocity is low, so the moon has been unable to hold any atmosphere. It cannot have surface water, and its interior cooled rapidly as its internal heat flowed outward into space. So small worlds have less heat and lose it more rapidly. So the moon's small size has been critical in determining its history. The Apollo moon rocks, especially an orphosite from the Highlands, show that the moon must have formed in a molten state. Planetary geologists now refer to the exterior of the newborn moon as magma ocean. So magma is the term for molten rock in general, whereas lava means molten rock flowing on the surface of a world. Denser material sank to the bottom of the magma, and as the magma cooled, low-density minerals floated to the top to form a low-density crust, and in this way the moon partly differentiated. The radioactive ages of moon rocks brought back by the Apollo astronauts showed that the surface solidified about 4.4 billion years ago. And the second stage, cratering, began as soon as the crust solidified. And the older Highlands showed that cratering was intense during the heavy bombardment period and at the end of planet building. The moon's crust was shattered, and the large impact formed giant multi-ring crater basins, hundreds of kilometers in diameter. The basin that became rains, for instance, was blasted out by the impact of an object about the size of Rhode Island. This Imbrium event occurred about 4 billion years ago and blanketed 16% of the moon with ejecta. So here we can see such an event. So by containing craters on different parts of the moon and calibrating those data using radioactive ages of lunar rock samples, planetary scientists have been able to chart the decline of cratering over the first billion years of the solar system's history. By about 3.8 billion years ago, the impact rate had decreased to the current low rate. But before that, there seems to have been a sudden burst of cratering astronomers called the Late Heavy Bombardment that might have included the Imbrium event. The primary evidence of this late bombardment comes from observations of the Moon, but that sudden storm of impacts must have affected all of the planets in the solar system, including Earth. Those craters on Earth were erased long ago, but they can be seen on other worlds such as Mercury, Mars, and some of the moons in the outer solar system. To understand what astronomers think caused the late heavy bombardment, you will need to learn more about the formation and evolution of Uranus and Neptune in Chapter 18. So astronomers can calculate that the tremendous impacts that formed the lunar basins would have cracked the crust to depths of 10 km or more and led to the third stage flooding. Through Earth's moon cooled rapidly after its formation, radioactive decay continued to heat lunar subsurface material, as it did inside Earth, and parts of the lunar mantle and lower crust remelted, producing lava that followed the cracks and into giant basins. And these basins were flooded by successive lava flows of dark basalts from 3.8 to 3.2 billion years ago, this forming the moraine. So here we can see these Imbrium event and the flooding. So studies of the moon show that its crust is thinner on the sideward towards Earth, perhaps due to tidal effects. Consequently, while lava flooded the basins on the earthward side, it was unable to raise through the thicker crust to flood the lowlands of the far side. One of the largest known impact basins in a solar system is the moon's south pole, the Aitken Basin, and it's about 2,500 kilometers in diameter and as deep as 13 kilometers in places. But flooding has never filled it with smooth lava flows to make an obvious moraine. So the fourth stage, slow surface evolution, has been more limited on the moon than on Earth because the moon has cooled rapidly and also lacks water. Flooding on Earth includes water, but the moon has never had an atmosphere, and this has never had liquid surface water. With no air and no water, erosion is limited to the constant bombardment of micrometeorites and rare larger impactors. As the moon lost its internal heat, volcanism died down and the moon became geologically dead. So its crust never divided into moving plates, evident from the fact that there are no folded mountain ranges, and the moon is now a one-plate object, frozen between stages 3 and 4. So you can go through this practicing with science on your own time. So that, ladies and gentlemen, was Earth and the Moon. Do you have any questions? So if there is no questions, we can go on to our next set of lecture slides, which is Mercury, Venus, and Mars. But before we start with that, let's take a quick 5-minute break. Okay, so let me answer a few questions that's in the chat. So first question, did Earth rapidly form its atmosphere due to the large impact that formed the moon? So not from the moon. So the impact that split off created the moon. But after that, the Earth and the moon both went through a bombardment stage. And it's that bombardment stage that brought the different volatiles that was needed to form the atmosphere. Then the second question, when was the last time people visited the moon? So the last time people visited the moon was at the end of the Apollo missions. So that was in 1972. And that is why there's such an emphasis of putting people back on the moon again. Then third question, so why have meteors colors when they enter the atmosphere? That is due to the composition of the meteor. So in high school, when you had natural sciences in a lab, if you burned certain elements, it burns in a certain color. So iron will burn in a certain color, nickel will burn in a certain color, copper will burn in a certain color. So that is why when meteors enter the atmosphere, or a meteoroid will enter the atmosphere and become a meteor, it will then burn depending on which elements they contain. I hope that that answers your question. So now when we looked at Earth and the Moon, we can now start looking at the other terrestrial planets. So those are Mercurius, Venus, and Mars. So which planet is this? Yes, that's Mercury. And because it was so much closer to the sun, that means when it formed, it has much higher temperatures. And that's why it differentiated into a metallic-like surface. So which planet is this? Yes, that is Venus. And one thing that we learned about, we actually had landers in the 80s and the 90s that landed on Venus as well. And then this planet, yes, that's Mars. You're correct. So have any one of you observed any of these planets through binoculars or a small telescope? So they are really special to do. So I see the astronomy club on campus, Blue Crane Space, are now organizing a stargazing evening sometime. But I will share that details with you guys as well. So for this lecture, we need to answer 4 questions. How is Mercury similar to and different from Earth's moon? Secondly, how does distance from the sun affect the planet and its atmosphere? Thirdly, how does size determine the geologic activity and evolution of planets? And then lastly, what is the evidence that Venus and Mars were once more Earth-like, and why did they change? So Mercury orbits so close to the Sun that it is difficult to observe from Earth, and little was known about it until in 1974 when the Mariner 10 spacecraft first flew past Mercury and revealed a planet with a heavily cratered surface resembling a larger version of Earth's moon. Analysis of the Mariner 10 data showed that large areas have been flooded by lava and then created. So spectacular new images and data arrived from the Messenger spacecraft that flew by Mercury 3 times before finally settling into orbit around the planet in 2011, beginning a close-up investigation that lasted until it ran out of maneuvering fuel and crashed in 2015. So here we can see enhanced images of the surface of Mercury. So the latest impact feature on Mercury is the Colorius Basin, a mountain ring basin that the MESSENGER photos reveal as 1,550 kilometers in diameter, resembling the large ring basin Mare Orientale, or the Eastern Sea on Earth's moon. The Caloris Basin on Mercury and Mare Orientale on the Moon both include concentric rings of cliffs formed by the large impact. So though Mercury looks moon-like, it does have several features that Earth's moon lacks. MESSENGER photographs revealed a spider of raised ridges appearing to extend from the near medium-sized craters, and geologists are not sure what process could have caused the spider. So images from both Mariner 10 and MESSENGER reveal long curved ridges called lobate scarps, up to 3 kilometers high and 500 kilometers long. These scraps even cut through craters, indicating that they formed after bombardment. And the lobate scarps are the kind of faults that form by compression. So this suggests that the entire crust of Mercury was compressed long ago. So here you can read this on your own, a comparison of Earth's moon and Mercury. So Mercury is quite dense, and models indicate that it must have a large metallic core. In fact, the metallic core occupies about 75% of the radius of the planet. In a sense, Mercury is a metal planet with a thin rock mantle and crust. And spectroscopic observations indicate that Mercury has an extremely thin atmosphere that may be partly outgassed from the crust and partly captured from the solar wind. The accumulated facts about Mercury don't really help you understand the planet until you have a unifying hypothesis. Like a story, it must make sense and bring the known facts together in a logical argument that explains how Mercury got to be the way it is. Mercury is small, and the fact has determined much of its history. Like Earth's moon, Mercury has lost most of its internal heat and thus no longer geologically active. In the first stage of its planetary history, Mercury differentiated to form a metallic core and a rocky mantle. The presence of a magnetic field about 1% as strong as Earth's is further evidence of a metallic core. So you learn in chapter 15 that the condensation sequence could explain a high abundance of metals in Mercury. But detailed calculations showed that Mercury contains even more iron than the condensation sequence would have predicted. Drawing on the large impact hypothesis for the origin of Earth's moon, scientists proposed that Mercury suffered a major impact after differentiation that drove away much of the rocky mantle. However, data from the MESSENGER, including images of surface hollows and many locations, indicate that a substantial amount of volatiles were incorporated in the crust and subsequently vaporize. Abundant volatiles would not have survived a giant impact, so an impact may not, after all, be the explanation of the size of Mercury's metal core. Mercury is now a one-plate planet, much like Earth's moon, lacking a significant atmosphere to erode its surface. Has changed little since the last lava hardened. So here we can see the MESSENGER enhanced images of a section of the floor and the peaking mountain ridges on Mercury. So now we need to talk about Venus. So you might expect Venus to be much like Earth. Its diameter is 95% of Earth's. It has a similar average density and composition, and just 30% closer to the Sun. So unfortunately, the surface of Venus is perpetually hidden below thick clouds. And only in the past few decades have planetary scientists discovered that Venus is a deadly hot desert world of volcanoes, lava flows, and impact craters laying within a deep atmosphere of hot gases. And no spacesuit is tough enough to allow you to visit the surface of Venus. In a composition, temperature, and density, the atmosphere of Venus is more Hades than heaven. The air is unbreathable, very hot, and almost 100 times denser than Earth's air. How do planetary scientists know this? Because US and Soviet space probes descended into the atmosphere and in a few cases landed and reported back from the surface. In composition, the atmosphere of Venus is roughly 96% carbon dioxide. The rest is mostly nitrogen with some argon, sulfur dioxide, and small amounts of sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, and hydrofluoric acid. There's only a tiny amount of water vapor. On the whole, the composition is deadly unpleasant and would certainly smell bad too. Spectra show that the impenetrable clouds that hide the surface are made up of droplets of sulfuric acid and microscopic crystals of sulfur. So here you can see the different temperatures in the atmosphere of Venus. So the strange atmosphere is 90 times denser than Earth's atmosphere. The air you breathe is 1,000 times less dense than water. But on Venus, the air is only 10 times less dense than water. So if you could survive the unpleasant conditions, you could strap wings on your arms and fly in Venus's atmosphere. The surface temperature on Venus is hot enough to melt lead. And you can understand that because the thick atmosphere creates a severe greenhouse effect. The sunlight filters down through the clouds and warms the surface. But heat cannot escape easily because the atmosphere is opaque to infrared radiation. And traces of sulfur dioxide and water vapor help trap the infrared. But it is overwhelming abundance of carbon dioxide that makes the greenhouse effect on Venus much more severe than on Earth. Although the thick clouds on Venus are opaque to visible light, they are transparent to radio waves, so astronomers have been able to map Venus using radar. As early as 1965, Earth-based radio telescopes made low-resolution maps, but later both US and Soviet spacecraft orbited Venus and mapped its surface by radar. And maps made in the early 90s by the Magellan spacecraft reveal objects as small as 100 meters in diameter. And radar maps of Venus are produced using arbitrary colors. In some maps, scientists have chosen to give Venus an overall orange glow because sunlight filtering down the clouds bathes the landscape in a perpetual sunset glow. Other radar maps have been colored gray and the natural color of the rocks. In yet other maps, lowlands are colored blue, but there are no oceans on Venus. So when you look carefully at colored radar maps of Venus, recall that its surface is a deadly dry desert. So by international agreement, names on Venus are all female, with three exceptions: Maxwell, a high mountain, and Alpha Reggio and Beta Reggio, two high volcanic peaks, which were all named before the IAU naming convention for Venus was adopted. Radar maps show that Venus is similar to Earth in one way, but strangely different in other ways. Nearly 75% of Earth's surface is covered by low-lying basaltic seafloors, and 85% of Venus' surface is covered by basalt lowlands. There is no liquid water on Venus. However, so its lowlands are not really seafloors and its remaining highlands are not like the well-defined continents you see on Earth. Whereas Earth is dominated by plate tectonics, something different is happening on Venus. The highland area, Isha Terra, named for the Babylonian goddess of love, is about the size of Australia. At its eastern edge, the mountain called Maxwell Montes rises to an altitude of 12 kilometers, with the impact crater Cleopatra on its lower slopes. For comparison, Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth, is 8.8 kilometers high. Bounded by mountain ranges, the north and west center of Isha Terra is occupied by Lakshmi Plume, a great plateau about 4 kilometers above the surrounding plains. The collapse, Calderas Colette and Sakasui suggest that the Plume is a lava plain, and the mountains bordering the Isha Tsera, including Maxwell, resemble folded mountain ranges, which suggests that limited horizontal motion in the crust as well as volcanism may have helped form the highlands. So you can go through this image on your own time. So as usual, you can learn more about other worlds by comparing them with each other and with Earth. So notice 3 important ideas plus 2 new terms. There are 2 main types of volcanoes found on Earth. Composite volcanoes are associated with mostly plate boundaries, and shield volcanoes are associated with hotspots that are not related to plate boundaries. Volcanoes on Venus and Mars, unlike Earth, all have the shape of shield volcanoes, the kind produced by hotspot volcanism rather than by plate tectonics. So some volcanoes on Venus and Mars are very large. They have grown to great sizes because of repeated eruptions at the same place in the crust. This is also evidence that neither Venus nor Mars has been dominated by horizontal plate tectonics like Earth. So many features on Venus testify to its volcanic history, and radar maps reveal shield volcanoes and long lava channels. Other volcanic features include the coronae circular bulges up to 2,600 kilometers in diameter, bordered by fractured volcanoes and lava flows, and coronae appear to be produced by rising convection currents of molten magma that push up under the crust, and when the magma withdraws, the crust sinks back, but the circular fractures mark the edge of the corona. So here is just an image of that you can also go through. So no astronaut has ever stood on Venus, but a few spacecraft have been landed on the surface and survived the heat and pressure for a few hours. And some of those spacecraft analyzed nearby rocks and snapped a few photographs. So the surface rocks on Venus are dark grey basalts, much like those in Earth's ocean floors. This is further evidence that volcanism is important on Venus. So while you are thinking about volcanoes, you can correct a common misconception. The molten rock that emerges from volcanoes comes from pockets of melted rock in the upper mantle and the lower crust, and not from the planet's molten core. So here on the top, so here we can see the Venera 13 landed, touched down on Venus in 1982, and carried a camera that swiveled from side to side to photograph the surface. The orange glow is produced by the thick atmosphere. So when that is corrected to produce the view as it would be under white light, you can see that the rocks are dark grey. Isotropic analysis suggests they are basalts. So radar images show that Venus is also marked by numerous craters, and the atmosphere protects the surface from smaller meteorites that would produce craters smaller than 3 kilometers in diameter. And larger meteorites penetrate the atmosphere and have formed about 10% as many craters on Venus as on the morae of Earth's moon. So the number of craters shown that the crust is not as ancient as the lunar morae, but also not as young as Earth's active surface. And the average age of the surface of Venus is estimated from crater counts to be roughly 500 million years. Geologic processes are not renewing the surface of Venus as rapidly as Earth's surface, but no heavily cratered terrain or large impact basins remain on Venus from the heavy bombardment era. So here we can see the impact crater Hauy in the foreground of this picture. So to tell the story of Venus, you must draw together all the evidence and find hypotheses to explain 2 things: the thick carbon dioxide atmosphere and the peculiar geology. So calculations show that Venus and Earth should have outgassed about the same amount of carbon dioxide. But Earth's oceans have dissolved most of Earth's carbon dioxide and converted it to sediments such as limestone. If all of Earth's carbon were dug up and converted back to carbon dioxide, our atmosphere would be about as dense as the air on Venus and composed mostly of carbon dioxide like Venus's atmosphere. This suggests that the main difference between Earth and Venus is the lack of water on Venus that would have removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There is evidence that Venus had oceans when it was young, but being closer to the sun, it was warmer, and the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere created a greenhouse effect that made the planet warm. So that process would have vaporized any oceans that did exist and reduced the ability of the planet to purge its atmosphere of carbon dioxide. As more carbon dioxide was outgassed, the greenhouse effect grew even more severe. Thus, Venus was trapped in what is called a runaway greenhouse effect. The intense heat at the surface may have affected the geology of Venus by making the crust more flexible, so that it was unable to break into moving plates as on Earth. There are no signs of real global plate tectonics on Venus, but rather evidence that convection currents below the crust are deforming the crust to create coronae and push-up mountains such as Maxwell. Other mountains, like those around Isha Terra, appear to be folded mountains caused by limited horizontal motions in the crust, driven by perhaps by convection in the mantle. So the small number of craters on the surface of Venus indicates that the entire crust has been replaced within the last 500 million years or so. So the resurfacing may have occurred as a planet-wide overturning as the old crust broke and sank, and lava flows created a new crust. Hypothesizing such drama may not be necessary. However, models of the climate on Venus showed that an outburst of volcanism could increase the greenhouse effect and drive the surface temperatures up by as much as 100 degrees Celsius. This could further soften the crust, increase the volcanism, and push the planet into a resurfacing episode. This type of catastrophe may happen periodically on Venus, or the planet may have had a single geologically recent resurfacing event. In either case, an unearthly Venus may eventually reveal more about how our own world works. So the next planet we need to talk about is Mars. So Mars is a medium-sized world, about half the diameter of Earth. The surface is old and marked by volcanoes, but as you explore, watch for evidence that water once flowed there. The Martian air contains 90% carbon dioxide, 3% nitrogen, and 2% argon. That is much like the chemical composition of the air on Venus. But a Martian atmosphere is very thin, less than 1% as dense as Earth's atmosphere, 1/10,000th as dense as Venus's atmosphere. There is very little water in the Martian atmosphere, and the polar caps are composed of frozen water ice coated over by frozen carbon dioxide or dry ice. As summer comes to the Martian hemisphere, planetary scientists observe the carbon dioxide in that polar cap turning from solid to vapor and adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, while winter in the opposite hemisphere is freezing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and adding that to the polar cap. Liquid water cannot survive on the surface of Mars because the air pressure is too low. Any liquid water would immediately boil away, and if you stepped out of a spaceship on Mars without a spacesuit, your body heat would make your blood boil. Whatever water is present on Mars must be frozen in the polar caps or in the form of permafrost within the soil. Although the presence of atmosphere of Mars is very thin, you will see evidence that a climate once permitted liquid water to flow over the surface. So Mars must have once had a thicker atmosphere. As a terrestrial planet, it should have outgassed significant amounts of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor, but because it was small and could not hold on to its gases, the escape velocity on Mars is only 5 kilometers per second, less than half Earth, so it was easier for rapidly moving gas molecules to escape into space. Another factor is the temperature of the planet. If Mars had been colder, the gas molecules in its atmosphere would have been traveling more slowly and would have not escaped easily. So you can see this in figure 17.8 that plots the escape velocity of each planet versus the temperature of the region from which molecules would escape. For Earth, the temperature is that in the upper atmosphere. For Mercury, the temperature is that of a hot, rocky surface. Clearly, small worlds cannot keep atmospheric gases easily. So you can go through these figures in your own time. So a further problem is that Mars has no ozone layer to protect its atmosphere from ultraviolet radiation. So sunbathing on Mars would be a fatal mistake. So the ultraviolet photons can break atmospheric molecules up into smaller fragments, which escape more easily. For example, water can be broken up into hydrogen and oxygen. This Mars is large enough to have had a substantial atmosphere when it was young, and may have had water falling as rain and collecting in rivers and lakes. It gradually lost much of its atmosphere and is now a cold, dry world. So if you ever visited another world, Mars may be your best choice. You will need a heated, pressurized spacesuit, but Mars is much more hospitable than the Moon or Venus. It is also more interesting, with weather, complex geology, and signs that water once flowed over its surface. You might even hope to find traces of ancient life hidden in the rocks. Spacecraft has been visiting Mars for almost 40 years. 2 Viking landers first touched down in 1976. Rover Spirit and Opportunity in 2004, carrying instruments to explore the rocky surface. The Phoenix Robot Laboratory landed in the North Polar region in 2008. The sophisticated rover laboratory Curiosity landed and began exploration of Mars in 2012. And since then, we have the InSight rover as well on Mars, that also landed a couple of years ago. So images made by a series of orbiting probes show that the southernmost hemisphere of Mars is heavily cratered highland region, estimated to be 2 to 3 billion years old. The northern hemisphere is mostly much younger lowland plain with fewer craters. This lowland plain may have been smoothed by lava flows, but growing evidence suggests that it was once filled with an ocean, a controversial hypothesis discussed in the next section. Volcanism on Mars, dramatically evident in the Taurus region, a highland region of volcanoes and lava flows bulging 10 kilometers above the surrounding surface. And a similar uplifted volcanic plain, the Elysium region, is more heavily cratered and eroded and appears to be older than the Phoresis bulge. The lack of many impact craters suggests that some volcanoes have been active within the last few 100 million years. So here you can take a comparison of these two different regions. And here as well, so here we can see Olympus Mons. So all of the volcanoes on Mars are shield volcanoes, which you learned earlier are produced by hotspots penetrating upward through the crust and are not related to plate tectonics. Olympus Mons, the largest volcano of Mars, is 600 kilometers in diameter at its base and rises 22 kilometers high. So interesting. Mount Olympus Mons is the highest mountain in our solar system, so it is 22 kilometers high. Putting in perspective, the highest mountain on Earth, Mount Everest, is 8.8 kilometers high. So the largest volcano on Earth, Mauna Loa in Hawaii, rises 10 kilometers above its base on the seafloor. Mauna Loa is so heavy that it has sunk into Earth's crust, producing an undersea moat around its base. In contrast, Olympus Mons, more than twice as high and has no moat and is supported entirely by the Martian crust. Evidently, the crust of Mars is stronger and thicker than Earth's. So the size of Olympus Mons also provides clear evidence that plate tectonics has not been significant on Mars. On Earth, shield volcanoes such as those that form the Hawaiian Islands occur over rising currents of hot material in the mantle. Because the plate moves, the hot material heats the crust in a string of locations and forms a giant chain of volcanoes instead of a single large feature. So the Hawaiian Islands are merely the most recent of a series of volcanic islands called the Hawaiian Emperor Island chain across the Pacific Ocean. In contrast, a lack of plate motion on Mars has allowed rising currents of magma to heat the crust repeatedly at locations of Olympus Mons and other volcanoes, building huge volcanic cones, much larger than any on Earth. So when the crust of a planet is strained, it may break, producing faults and rift valleys near the Phoresus region is a great valley, the Valley Marinus, named after the Mariner 9 spacecraft that first photographed it. This valley is a block of crust that has dropped downward along parallel faults. Erosion and landslides have further modified the valley into a great canyon stretching almost 1/5 of the way around the planet. It is 4 times deeper, nearly 10 times wider, and over 10 times longer than the Grand Canyon. The number of craters in the valley indicates that it is 1 to 2 billion years old, placing its origin somewhere before the end of the most active volcanism on the Phoresus region. Before you can tell the story of Mars, you must first consider a difficult issue: water. How much water has Mars had, and how much has been lost, and how much remains? The quest for water on Mars is exciting because biologists are sure that life on Earth depends on water. And you will learn in this section that Mars evidently had abundant liquid water on its surface for at least as long as it took life to arise on Earth. If conditions under which the life started on Earth existed on Mars at the same time, then Mars provides a real opportunity for scientists to check the hypothesis about how life began on Earth. Beginning in 1976 with the Viking program and continuing to the present day, spacecraft orbiting Mars such as the Mars Odyssey, which reached Mars in 2001, Mars Express in 2002, and Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2006, have returned photos showing that water once flowed over the surface. All of those missions except Viking are still operating at the time of writing this in 2016, but those are still operating as we speak right now. And as you have learned, liquid water cannot exist now on the Martian surface because it would boil away in the extremely low atmospheric pressure. So evidence that water once flowed on Mars means that surface conditions there must have been quite different long ago. So several types of formations hint at a Martian surface. We have outflow channels appear to have been cut by massive floods carrying as much as 10,000 times the volume of water flowing down the Mississippi River. And such floods apparently swept away landscape features and eroded deep channels. The number of craters formed on top of the outflow channels show that they are billions of years old. Valley networks look like meandering riverbeds that probably formed over long periods. And the valley networks are also located in the heavily cratered southern hemisphere, so they must be very old as well. There are many other signs that there has been water on the Martian surface, some of which are geologically recent. Regions of collapsed terrain appear to be places where subsurface water has drained away. Gullies leading downhill appear to have been eroded recently, judging from the lack of craters, and a few gullies have been seen to appear between the Martian year and the next. And in 2015, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter made a spectroscopic observations confirming present-day seasonal groundwater flows. So in this image we have just been talking about, in these images as well. So many flow features lead to the northern lowlands, and the smooth terrain there has been interpreted as an ancient ocean floor. Features along the edges of the lowlands are comparable to shorelines, and many planetary scientists conclude that the northern lowlands contained an ocean when Mars was younger. Did Mars once have enough water to fill a sea? So deuterium is 3 to 5 times more abundant relative to normal light hydrogen in the Martian atmosphere than on Earth, suggesting that Mars once had at least 20 times more water than it has now. Presumably much of that water was broken up by solar UV radiation and normal hydrogen disproportionately lost to space, like the process hypothesized to have destroyed Venus's water. So abundant Mars water could survive frozen in the soil and crustal rocks, and instruments aboard the Mars Odyssey spacecraft detected water frozen in the soil over large areas of the planet. If you added a polar bear, changed the colors, and hid the craters, it would look like a broken pack of ice on Earth's Arctic Ocean. And Mars Express photographed these dust-covered formations near the Martian's equator. And the shallow depth of the crater suggests that the ice is still there, just below the surface. So much more of the ice on Mars may be hidden below the polar caps. Radar aboard the Mars Express orbiter was able to penetrate 3.7 kilometers under the surface and mapped ice deposits in the crust of the planet's south polar region. There's enough water there, at least 90% pure, to cover the entire planet in depth of 11 meters. The Phoenix probe landed at 2008 near Mars' North Pole, finding water ice mixed with the soil, not only as permafrost, but also as small chunks of pure ice, indicating there once was standing water that froze in place. Rover Spirit and Opportunity landed in areas suspected of once having had water on their surfaces. As of July 2016, Opportunity was still roving and communicating with Earth more than 12 years after it landed. So Opportunity, I think, is now been out of commission the last 2 years. So both rovers have found evidence of past water, including small spherical concentrations of the mineral hematite, dubbed blueberries, that require abundant water to form. In other words, Opportunity found layers of sediments with ripple marks and crossed layers showing they were deposited in moving water. Chemical analysis of rocks at both the Opportunity and Spirit sites detected sulfates, much as Epsom salts plus bromides and chlorides. On Earth, those compounds are left behind when water bodies such as desert lakes dry up. In its first year at work, the Curiosity rover discovered rounded rocks, the sort produced by running streams. So this is the blueberry rocks that was just talking about. So Mars has water, but it's hidden. So when humans reach Mars, they will not need to dig far to find water in the form of ice. They can use solar power to break the water into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen is fuel and oxygen is the breath of life. So water on Mars may prove to be buried treasure. Even more exciting is the knowledge that Mars definitely once had bodies of liquid water on its surface. It is a desert world now, but someday an astronaut might scramble down an ancient Martian streambed, turn over a rock and find a fossil. It is even possible that life started on Mars and has migrated to persist as the planet gradually became less hospitable. For example, life may have hung on by retreating to limited warm and wet oases underground. You will learn in the final chapter about possible evidence of ancient life in one of the Martian meteorites. So, did Mars ever had plate tectonics, and where did water go? So these fundamental questions challenge you to assemble the evidence and hypothesis of Mars and tell the story of its evolution. The four-stage history of Mars is a case of arrested development. The planet began by differentiating into a crust, mantle, and core. Studies of its rotation revealed that it has a dense core. The Mars Global Surveyor spacecraft detected no planet-wide magnetic field, but it did find regions of the crust with fields a bit over 1% as strong as Earth's. Apparently, the young Mars had a molten iron core and generated a magnetic field, which became frozen into parts of its crust. The core must have cooled quickly and shut off the dynamo effect that was producing the planet-wide field, and the magnetic regions of the crust remained behind like fossils. The crust of Mars is now quite thick, as shown by the mass of Olympus Mons, but it was probably thinner in the past. Cratering may have broken or at least weakened the crust, triggering lava flows that flooded some basins. Most of the northern hemisphere may have been a huge impact basin that was later filled with water, creating a Martian ocean that has since vanished, and mantle convection may have pushed the Phorasus and Elysium volcanic regions and broken the crust to form valles Marinus. But moving crustal plates never dominated Mars. There are no folded mountain ranges on Mars and no signs of plate boundaries, and the large size of volcanoes on the planet is evidence that the crust does not move. So planetary scientists therefore conclude that as Mars' interior cooled, its crust grew thick and immobile. At some point in the history of Mars, water was abundant enough to flow over the surface in great floods and may have filled oceans, but the age of liquid water must have ended more than 3 billion years ago. The climate on Mars has changed as atmospheric gases and water were lost to space, and water was frozen into the soil as permafrost. So for Mars, the fourth stage of planetary development has been one of moderate activity and slow decline. Volcanoes may still occasionally erupt, but this medium-sized planet has lost much of its internal heat, and most volcanism occurred long ago. The atmosphere is thin and the surface is a forbiddingly dry, cold desert. So now we can put comparative planetology against one another. So Venus and Mars share at least one characteristic. They have evolved since they formed and are now quite different than they were in the solar system was young. Moreover, they have learned planetary scientists have evidence that surface conditions on Venus, Earth, and Mars were much more similar long ago than they are now. So notice four important points. Firstly, the difference between Venus and Earth is not the amount of CO2 they have outgassed, but in the amount they have removed from their atmospheres. Being warmer and consequently less liquid water on its surface sealed Venus' fate as a runaway greenhouse. Secondly, Venus is highly volcanic with a crust made up of lava flows that have covered over any older crust. And the entire planet has been resurfaced with the last half billion years. Thirdly, Mars is significantly smaller than Earth, with gravity too weak to prevent much of its atmosphere from leaking away. And evidence shows that Mars once had a liquid water on its surface, but much of its water has been lost to space. The low atmospheric pressure means that the only remaining water is frozen in the soil. And then fourthly, because Mars is small, its interior cooled relatively quickly and volcanism died down. And the lack of volcanism means that escaping atmosphere is not replenished. So the planet's crust was thinner when the planet was young, but has grown thick and never broke into moving plates as did Earth's crust. So unlike Mercury or Venus, Mars has also moons. So small in irregular shape, so Phobos and the other one is Deimos, are probably captured asteroids and and photographs reveal a unique set of narrow parallel grooves of Phobos, averaging 150 meter wide and 25-meter deep. And the grooves run from Stickney, the largest crater, to an oddly featureless region on the opposite side of the satellite. One theory suggests that the grooves are deep fractures caused by the impact that formed Stickney. So here are the moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos. So Deimos not only has no grooves, but it also looks smoother because of thicker layers of dust on its surface. And this material partially fills craters and covers minor surface irregularities. It seems likely that Deimos experienced many collisions in its past, so its fractures may be hidden below the debris. So the debris on the surface on the moons raise an interesting question. How can the weak gravity of small bodies hold any fragments from meteor impacts? And the escape velocity of Phobos is about 11 meters per second. An athletic astronaut who can jump 2 meters high on Earth could jump 3.4 kilometers on Phobos. Most of the fragments from the impact should escape, but the slowest particles could fall back into weak gravity and accumulate on the surface, and that cushioning layer turn could help trap more debris. Because Deimos is smaller than Phobos, its escape velocity is smaller, so it seems surprising that it has more debris on its surface, and this may be related to Phobos' orbit close to Mars, and the Martian gravity is almost strong enough to pull the loose material off over the surface, so Phobos may be able to retain less cratering impact debris. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is our lecture on our terrestrial planets. Do you guys have any questions? So why is Venus considered much hotter than Mercury when Mercury is the closest planet to the Sun? That is due to the greenhouse effect on Mercury. So it cannot radiate all of its heat back into space. So yes, it's radiating a bit more heat, but it's still getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And that is why Venus is a lot more warmer than Mercury. Are there any other questions? So if there's no questions, have a wonderful evening. I'll see you all next Monday in class, and good luck with the rest of your week.